Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. Yesterday we discussed renewed fears that the poor southwestern province of Guizhou is in a state of de facto bankruptcy. That is, it is unable to avoid a potentially highly destabilizing default without external, i.e. central government support. Over the last 48 hours, there has been a lot of commentary on this concerning development, and to start off today's video, we shall supplement yesterday's episode by examining some of this commentary. Chinese financial media outlet Caixin published a special editorial with contributions from several of their top writers, observing that Guizhou's financial woes are part of the wider systemic challenge of local government fiscal issues, a theme we have been following closely on China Update for some time. Quote, "The long-standing issue of local debt, which has not been far from the public's mind, has recently caused a great uproar. As far as China's local debt problem is concerned, the most worrying issue is the size of the outstanding implicit debt, for which there has never been reliable data." End quote. The editors observe that the issue of expanding the use of local government special bonds has also raised serious concerns. Local government special bonds are supposed to be issued for public welfare projects that generate a specific return and are then supposed to be repaid with corresponding government funds or special revenues over a set period of time. Quote, "Since 2019, the scope of their use has been expanding, especially since special bonds are allowed to be used to supply capital for major projects, and since their duration to maturity was significantly extended. In 2022, the scale of local government's issuance of special bonds exceeded 5 trillion yuan for the first time, an all-time high that was more than double the issuance size in 2019. As of the end of 2022, the balance of local special bonds reached 20.67 trillion yuan, accounting for more than 20% of the bond market. This rapid growth in this kind of debt has led to a sharp increase in interest payments. Special bonds are no longer living up to their name and have become de facto general debt, making it more difficult to accurately assess government debt risks." End quote. Regular viewers will not be surprised to hear any of this. We've been following this process in real time for well over a year now. The editorial observes what we have been arguing on China Update for some time, that this building fiscal and financial crisis is not the result of some bad actors making bad decisions, but the predictable result of systemic causes, specifically within the local central fiscal relations. Quote, "All these issues represent a challenge to fiscal discipline and test the country's ability to govern. However, the fundamental problem lies in the lagging of institutional and mechanism reforms, and the failure to straighten out the fiscal relations between levels of government." End quote. Put simply, the central government sets the spending obligations and revenue sources for local governments, directing greater spending obligations than revenue permitted. This has caused local governments to turn to extra budgetary revenue sources to meet spending obligations, typically infrastructure spending to meet growth and employment goals. Most famously, or infamously, depending on one's perspective, through relying on land use rights revenue, in turn contributing to another serious systemic challenge, the land and housing market. The incentive structure is perverse too. The Caixin editors note, quote, "The performance evaluation system and promotion mechanism for local officials still encourages them to prioritize investment over fiscal discipline." End quote. This is not a new complaint. The Caixin editors, employing firm language, urge Beijing to push through painful reforms now before it's too late, adding, incredibly, that the province of Guizhou should not be bailed out, because this will only serve to perpetuate the cycle of poor fiscal decision-making. Quote, "In short, on the issue of local government debt, the principle of no central bailout must be upheld. If one place is bailed out, others will inevitably follow, which will further stimulate the increase in local debt and lead to unrest in the country.
Over the next 2 years, local government debt repayments will peak and risks will become increasingly apparent. At such a critical time, it is necessary to adhere to fiscal discipline." End quote. Beijing policymakers, however, may believe that this is easier said than done. On this topic, we'll touch on one more piece of commentary before we move on to the other developments. This is from our old friend, Professor Michael Pettis, who warns that Guizhou is just the beginning. Quote, "Guizhou seems to have become an early test case for what is likely to be a much larger group of struggling provinces. Guizhou has called in the help of Cinda, the asset management company associated with China Construction Bank, and is meeting with large banks. It also met with China's state asset regulator, seeking guidance on SOE reforms and cooperation between central and local authorities. Guizhou, like other provinces, is hoping it can restructure its way out of its debt burden, but it's too late for that. Until it starts allocating provincial assets to cover the huge losses it accumulated through excess infrastructure spending, it will just be marking time." End quote. Okay, next up, the UK, Singapore, and the property sector. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. It's just me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation. Subscribing and sharing is a huge help as well, and for those who can go the extra mile and help me keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. The UK Foreign Secretary has delivered a major speech on China. Commentators observe that this is unprecedented, pointing out that this is the first time a Foreign Secretary has used a Mansion House speech to deliver this sort of address, and the first speech from a Foreign Secretary entirely on the UK's China policy in over a decade. The Foreign Secretary called for the UK to have a more constructive and robust relationship with China, but to avoid decoupling, expressing, quote, "No significant global problem, from climate change to pandemic prevention, from economic stability to nuclear proliferation, can be solved without China," end quote. How was the speech received? Quote, "His speech will frustrate many China hawks in Parliament. This cross-party caucus will likely argue over the coming days that his speech is a callback to the golden era, full of flimsy rhetoric that fails to grasp the issue at hand and paints them as a single block with no nuance at all. Ultimately, it seems likely that their criticisms will fall on deaf ears in Downing Street and the Foreign Office, partly because few have offered a coherent view of what successful strategic engagement with China looks like outside of calling for sanctions, anti-economic coercion measures, and other human rights issues." End quote. Others in the UK media have similar observations. Quote, "Overall, he set himself apart from advocates of economic decoupling, including some of his own backbenchers, saying he wanted Britain to engage directly with China, bilaterally and multilaterally, to preserve and create open, constructive and stable relations, reflecting China's global importance. Although he said the mass incarceration in Xinjiang cannot be ignored or brushed aside, he said, 'We believe in a positive trade and investment relationship while avoiding dependencies in critical supply chains.'" End quote. Next up, on Monday, Singaporean companies deepened ties with their Shanghainese counterparts with the signing of a slew of agreements between the two cities at the 4th Singapore-Shanghai Comprehensive Cooperation Council. At the event, a record 15 memoranda of understanding were signed between Singapore and Shanghai, and officials at the event trumpeted the increased cooperation and trade between the two cities. According to official data, bilateral trade grew by 8% in 2022 year-on-year to $15 billion. 6,000 Singapore-linked projects based in Shanghai, mostly in the sectors of real estate, financial services, and manufacturing, saw growth and investment. Singapore-based media outlet The Straits Times writes that, quote, "Most of the participants at the event agreed that the key attraction of the Shanghai market is its size, which is about 4 times as large as Singapore's," end quote. adding that it was the strongest spending power among Chinese cities too. Quote, with disposable income rising by almost 2% year-on-year in 2022 to some 84,000 yuan, over $12,000, this growing affluence translates into sustained demand for mid to high-end goods and services. End quote. And finally for today, after 10 years of work, yesterday, Tuesday, the Minister of Natural Resources, Wang Guanghua, announced that the country has finally established a unified registration system that covers all types of immovable property rights. The United Asset Network has more than 1.5 billion records nationwide, covering both land use rights and property, and will be updated in real time. Commentators observe that this system is a precondition for imposing a property tax on the country. Quote, the registration system lays an important foundation for a national property tax, but it's not a good time to do that. The home market remains a drag on the economy. End quote. Beijing has been trying to roll out a property tax for years, but always faced tremendous political and practical pushback. This latter pushback has now been reduced. However, the former still very much remains. Quote, there is a reason officials have talked about a property tax for over a decade, but it never happens. A property tax has been politically impossible. Too many officials and their family members have properties they can't explain based on their official incomes and can't afford property tax on based on their official incomes. In addition, levying a property tax will anger everyone who stretched to buy a home and raise calls for more transparency and accountability about how the tax dollars are spent. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful Wednesday wherever you are, and I will see you all tomorrow.